Hello and welcome to everybody to the European Network Work with Perpetrators of Domestic Violence webinar on national lobbying for change and funding with a focus on GREVIO shadow reporting. My name is Lorna. As I've already said, I am the communications manager here at WWP, stepping in for Anna while she's away. For those of you who know Anna, she will be coming back. This is my first webinar with WWP, so it's a very exciting moment for me. Just a couple of logistical things before we get going. Just during the presentation, if you can make sure that your mic is muted, and if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, please write them in the chat box and Alessandra will answer them at the end of the presentation. I will remind you, as I said in my email, this presentation is being recorded. So please turn off your videos if you don't wish to be in the recording. So we're really happy to see so many people here. We centered our theme this month around the Istanbul Convention and the GREVIO, and how we can use these important tools as a way of shining a light on the issue of domestic violence and, of course, on perpetrator work. We couldn't have foreseen that this would be very timely, and our campaign became part of a bigger conversation following, first of all, the statistics released by the World Health Organization at the beginning of the month, stating that 1 in 3 women globally have been subjected to violence, which coincided with the terrible disappearance and murder of a woman in London, and got many people asking what we can do to change men's behavior to make the world safer for women. And then, of course, Turkey decided to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention, which is part of a bigger backlash against this legal document, and makes it even more important that we focus on how we can strengthen it as a network and also as organizations trying to prevent violence against women. So it's off the back of a very interesting and pivotal month that we are hosting this webinar. And I hope that these recent events, as shocking as they are, can act as a driving force for renewed interest in the work that we as a network and you as organizations and individuals in the field carry out every day. So I will introduce you to our webinar facilitator today. We're very lucky to be hearing from our executive director, the executive director of WWP, that is. That's Alessandra Pounce. As many of you already know, she has a multitude of experience spanning more than 20 years in the field of domestic violence, both working with victims and with perpetrators. And she is one of the best people to be delivering this webinar. She has experience in fund and awareness raising at a local, regional, national, and European level. So I will let Alessandra take it from here.
Okay, well, welcome to everybody. I am thrilled to be here. I am a little surprised at the success of this webinar and also of the attendance, because the topic is rather focused and specific. It's reporting to the Istanbul Commission of GREVIO. However, I think that in discussing the aspect of how we address local, national, regional, and European institutions, and how we lobby has a lot to do with the identity with which we are perceived in working with perpetrators of domestic violence. So there is a lot around also how we communicate this. However, the focus of the webinar is going to be quite specific in this sense. We are going to talk about perpetrator programs and the conversations around domestic violence, and how it may sometimes be difficult for perpetrator programs to be part of this conversation. So how we can think about shifting the conversation so that we can engage more easily in being visible on the one hand, but also being active participants in the conversation around domestic violence. So we are then going to be discussing about how shifting this conversation is about also holding men accountable, obviously, and making perpetrator programs visible, why we need to address public institutions, how to address public institutions at different levels, how to use the Istanbul Convention, and finally about the GREVIO reporting and how to use that to lobby. Obviously, this is a lot to be condensed in 1 hour. So basically, I'm going to give you the highlights of all that I have just mentioned. But for those of you that are interested in actually going more in depth and having more of a roadmap of how you can actually activate all this for your specific programs, we are going to be having a 3-hour training workshop on the 13th of April. So you can take this as a teaser and see how much of the questions that you have are answered in the course of this webinar. But then I think it probably won't be possible to answer all the questions that are related to the issues that I will be discussing that have a lot of background information that we have created. So we have been quite actively working on GREVIO reporting and how this can give visibility to perpetrator programs. I will be in the course of this hour also giving you some examples of how this has been enabling for perpetrator programs. This is also part of a larger conversation that as perpetrator programs, we need to be doing together, because obviously creating change lobbying is about creating change, and social change is about being able to work together in a certain direction. So hopefully this webinar will also help us start coordinating a European strategy that will, in the long run, be beneficial for each, because it will dribble down at a national country. So that is a very long introduction for the issue. I'm going to now share my screen. Is it full screen, Lorna?
Yes, I can see it.
Assume it is. Okay. So, as I mentioned, we're talking about national lobbying, we're talking about social change, and we're talking about having perpetrator programs recognized, having them within the conversation on social change and domestic violence obviously also ties into the funding, because when you're visible and when you recognize that perpetrator programs are important, then it follows that they should be funding. We will then work into how that works into the GREVIO shadow reporting. So first of all, since you are not all familiar with our organization, I have chosen a slightly different way of presenting our organization. And I am going to be using the materials that you're going to be seeing at 2 levels. So on the one hand, I would like you to pay attention to the content that I was showing. So this is going to be a video that explains the activities of WWP. But at the same time, I want you also to be thinking about how we are shaping the conversation around perpetrator program and domestic violence when we are communicating. So I want you to look at it at content level, but I also want you to analyze all the communication that I will be discussing with you and sharing with you also at the meta level. So how are we trying to communicate and how are we trying to shift the conversation? So it's a practice and theory together. Let's challenge your multitasking skills. Okay. Okay. Nope, we don't want to go here yet.
Shut your mouth. Shut your mouth.
Sorry, this went. I guess it left. Okay, so just if you can just write sort of in the chat the first things that come to mind after having seen the presentation of WWP, just a few quick comments. One. This is interactive. Quick, short, informative. Okay, any other ideas that come to mind? So interesting. I think somebody has their mic open. So the development of this video, and here I'm sort of going to shift between sort of the meta and the content of what we're discussing, had started with a lot of soul searching on who are we and how do we communicate who we are, okay? And this has to do with us as a network of perpetrator programs, but it's also obviously very closely related with how you talk about perpetrator work. So at a local level, I'm a perpetrator program, and at least in my experience in working with perpetrators, that is often, especially when we're talking about funding, a rather hard sell, you know? Perpetrators are not cute babies. They're not bunnies. They're not, it's really hard to move sympathies towards the necessity of working with perpetrators. So on the other hand, obviously, we think that promoting certain kind of perpetrator work, obviously victim focused and gender informed perpetrator work, is an important part of creating the conversation on safety for women. So in the case of the network, it was also that we're sort of slightly more removed. So we're not even doing the work directly with perpetrators at a local level. We're far removed. We're in Europe. So it was about focusing on how we create change and how we communicate the importance of the work that we're doing. So this was sort of part of the brainstorming, and you'll see, I'll give you other examples during the course of this webinar, because a very important part of the lobbying effects and with the conversations that you have locally, nationally, and then obviously reporting to GREVIO is sort of a wider conversation that brings all this together, is what kind of conversations are happening in your country on domestic violence, and how do perpetrator programs fit into that conversation. So the second thing I want to highlight is a few reflections around these conversations, because this is where we fit in. This is where people that are that we are going to be talking about funding at any level. This is their starting point. This is the general information that they're going to have on domestic violence. Mind you, one of the issues that we have to consider every time we're approaching any level of institutions is they are absolutely nothing about perpetrator programs. And the very little that they know is usually not very positive, because obviously, what do we know about perpetrators? So this is where the general conversation fits in. And I'm going to go back to my slides because I'm going to be showing some other, okay, so this one we've seen, this one about the conversation.
Shut your mouth. Shut your mouth.
Hard to watch, isn't
Where you
it?
going? You're sorry?
Does this make it easier?
You're sorry again, huh?
How about this?
How stupid you
Maybe
are.
you should just look
How
away.
stupid are you? Tell me how stupid you are. I don't want to hear it.
Is that better? It's hard to watch, but if you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, make the call.
So, I mean, I chose this one partly because it was short and it represents, and I mean, some of them are even more brutal, but it represents quite well what the conversation around domestic violence is and the stereotype or the image that people will have in their heads when we're talking about domestic violence. And I can come back to many, many different campaigns. This is just one example of these campaigns. There's zero tolerance campaigns, and they have been mainstream for about 20 years in the field. Again, there is not only the sort of stereotypical image of victims with a black eye, there's also a stereotypical hairdo. It's usually dark hair and it's sort of collected low to the end and has a very sort of subdued aspect, but obviously it's a very rigid stereotype. This is an Italian campaign done by the Equal Opportunities Committee, and I think it's interesting for us because it shows it says a violent does not deserve your love. So it's again there's not even it's not even a person. It's just a perpetrator. He doesn't deserve your love. He deserves that you press charges. So again, it's a zero tolerance campaign, but I think that the particularly interesting part of this campaign is that it has, on the one hand, a referral to the fact that this is clearly a couple that is in what seems like an affectionate and intimate relationship. They're embraced and sort of there's a physical closeness to the two of them, but the man doesn't have a face. And instead of the face of the man, it says violence has 1,000 different faces. Learn how to recognize them. So violence is not about the person. It's not about possible change. It's about indicators and signals that you have to learn to recognize so that you can steer away from them. So obviously, in terms of perpetrator programs, what can we work with here? You know, what can the men that have a problem with violence identify with any of these campaigns? I mean, I think that most of the perpetrators in our program may have not given a black eye. I know it's very rare that there are such strong physical signs. There may be some black and blue marks somewhere, but that's actually a relatively rare physical consequence. So it's not something that they would identify. And this kind of campaign is completely alienating because there's not even a person. So obviously there's no space for change. So this is a first step about, before we can even go and lobby, before we can influence the institutions, we need to be aware that we need to shift the conversation. And the people that we are approaching, the campaigns, and also the general public are starting from these points of knowledge. So how can we talk about violence towards different aspects that shift away from the dominant conversation on domestic violence, where perpetrators are sort of stereotyped as the monster and victims as absolute victims, and looking at different aspects like breaking the cycle of violence, like children that are seeing violence and that need support, need to understand things differently, about how this is sort of central to the change around violence. And yeah, any comments just on, okay, so moving forward. Okay. So we've seen how we have sort of a dominant paradigm on domestic violence, how we need to be able to discuss about perpetrator programs. We need to, number one, we need to create more knowledge around what perpetrator programs are. And we need to shift the conversation to aspects that are centered on the accountability, holding men accountable. Men are responsible for violence in most of the cases, and we need to make perpetrators visible, therefore perpetrator programs visible, and we need to shift the conversation to holding men accountable. To be able to do what? What are the conversations, and who should we be having these conversations with? So, of course, on the one hand, there's the general public. The general public has to do also with men arriving to the program, because clearly the numbers that our perpetrator programs will be producing are going to be central in having recognition from public institutions. If we have perpetrator programs that have very few perpetrators arriving, it's going to be much harder to convince the institutions and convince the general public that this is a relevant phenomena. And to be able to get perpetrator programs in programs, we need to make conversations to which the perpetrators can respond. So part of this shifting the conversation has to do with the general audience and actually getting men in to the programs. And by the way, I mean, if you see in our annual campaigns that we have as WWP every year, we have usually at least one element that is directly addressed to perpetrator. It's the postcard in the campaign. It has questions that are meant to get the men thinking about certain behaviors that they may have not recognized as abusive, but that they should be questioning. So we are talking at various levels. We're talking about to the general audience. Among this general audience, there's obviously a high number of men and women that have been victims of violence, and men that are perpetrators, and trying to shift the general conversation around this and the possibility of accessing help and knowing about perpetrator programs. This is going to help us in having the visibility and the recognition at the local level, because when we go to our local institutions, we need to be able to say, this is why perpetrator programs are important. Perpetrators are asking for help. We need to be able to help them be accountable. We need to be able to respond to them. Thus, we need funding, because that's basically the streamline of the conversation. So being able to have men in the program is part of going to the institutions and getting the recognition and thus the funding that you need. Public institutions need to be addressed for various reasons at various levels. First of all, because our reading of violence is that of an ecological model. Because on the one hand, up to now, we've talked about men coming to the programs somehow self-referred, because when we're talking about general communication and general men realizing there's a problem, we're talking about self-referrals. Then obviously we have the whole part of mandated referrals, but that's part of institutions recognizing violence, being able to assess it, being able to send the perpetrators to the programs. We have throughout Europe some countries in which there isn't much of a referral system, other countries in which there is a referral system, but men don't get sent to the programs. Other situations in which there are many situations of domestic violence, but the judicial system has trouble recognizing them. A lot of them go through civil cases, and then perpetrators are not sent to programs. So we have a huge problem of gap of knowledge within the various public institutions. And this can be addressed only working with institutions. So in order to enable change, we have to work with perpetrators, but as much as we have to work with perpetrators, we have to work with public institutions. Since we are all involved and engaged in a campaign, in a social movement against eliminating violence against women, we need to move in the direction of changing the whole structure of society. So I'm sure you're familiar with this, the ecological model. So we're talking local, so we're talking in the ecological model, it's individual, relationship, communities, and larger circles of working on domestic violence. I'm sorry for those of you that are not sort of more familiar with these concepts. Maybe you can email us afterwards and we can explain some things, but I am giving for granted many aspects of basic knowledge on domestic violence and on work with perpetrators, because this webinar is sort of specifically geared towards a different sort of, has a different sort of task and goal. So I apologize for those of you for which I know I'm sort of skipping a series of aspects, but that is for another webinar. So when we translate this into addressing public institutions, and addressing public institution has to always be about how we are creating social change, how we're creating pushes towards eliminating violence against women, and how we're creating it at the various levels. And again, what we see in terms of re-victimizations through the legal system, through the judicial system, through the fact that men are not being processed after charges are pressed. In Italy, 93% of women don't press charges. So we're talking about a very small minority, and even in that small minority of cases, the system systematically fails victims. So this is a huge problem, and a huge problem that has been repeatedly stressed and shown and fought for by victim support services. But our voice needs to be heard, because we can support the accountability process of the perpetrators. We are an important part of making the perpetrators visible and making them accountable, because the fact that if perpetrators are sent to a perpetrator program, if they come, if they don't come, if they come, how they come. So it's as much what happens within the perpetrator program with our programs it's as much as what happens outside of the perpetrator program. It's as much as the perpetrators that don't arrive or that decline to come to a perpetrator program. Because if we are working in close network with all these different levels of intervention, then we are giving feedback about the fact that perpetrators are not committed to a program, and so that they are still dangerous. And in this way, we are helping the system stay accountable. This kind of messaging is what we need to take forward when we are talking with the local institutions, and why we need to be engaged. We have to be engaged in this conversation, because this kind of feedback, this kind of expertise, this kind of knowledge is unique to perpetrator programs. Nobody else has that kind of access to perpetrators. Nobody else has that kind of knowledge of how to work with them. And so these are sort of the crucial selling points of how we have to interact and promote the work that we're doing. And since all these levels are linked in different ways, it cannot be something that happens only locally, because locally we will be talking with our city council, we will be talking with our local healthcare system. But within these structures, if they're not higher levels of change that are happening, then we cannot expect a difference. If the legal system doesn't change and allow for communication between perpetrator programs and the judicial system, then we can't have that level of conversation. So we need local protocols, but we need this change to be going up regionally. We need to work with the regions, because then we can push also at a national level, and we have to go independently to a national level as NGOs to have our voices heard. All this is strongly linked to the European legislation, because the Istanbul Convention and the countries that have ratified the Istanbul Convention recognize that the Istanbul Convention is legally binding. This is extremely important, because saying that the Istanbul Convention is legally binding means that whatever in any form of not complete information of our legal system, it is the Istanbul Convention that enters into force. And the Istanbul Convention is an extremely strong document in terms of the positioning that it takes on domestic violence. So just to sort of anticipate how then the GREVIO reporting, what we've been sort of hinting to, why we've been insisting so much on the GREVIO reporting, because the GREVIO reporting connects the local level to the regional level to the national level to the European level. We can be reporting on a small NGO in one specific town in one specific country. This reporting may be the only information that arrives to GREVIO on that specific topic, on perpetrator programs. This means that when the GREVIO is going to be visiting at a national level, they are going to be called, this small organization, as a national representative. So that means that any local NGO that's done this process is going to be jumping immediately as talking directly on behalf of perpetrator programs at a national level and at a European level. This means that this might influence the recommendations that GREVIO will be giving at a national level, that makes the GREVIO recommendation immediately into a lobbying tool. So see how the different levels. Some countries have national networks, even better. In that case, you can work sort of together to get a stronger report, but most countries don't have national reporting. What has been happening so far? What has been happening is that most national reports, so the Istanbul Convention has evaluating body, that's the GREVIO committee, that has national visits to check on how each country has been doing in implementing the Istanbul Convention. And there are sort of two parallel phases on this. On the one hand, there is an official government that's reporting on how they think they're doing. And on the other hand, we have the NGOs that can present shadow reports. Women's support services are quite organized. They usually have a network of organizations that present this shadow report. And there we say things as they are, because obviously the government has a lot of interest in sort of showing their best face. And on the other hand, there are the NGOs that are also telling about the lack of funding, telling about the lack of collaboration, telling about all these problems that we're having with the judicial system. So that's where sort of the real stuff happens. And the GREVIO is also willing to give anonymity if it's dangerous for somebody. If somebody doesn't want to be exposed, you can also do it in a very private version. But what's been happening up to now, there has been no reporting on perpetrator programs. Countries have not talked about perpetrator programs. So the risk is that perpetrator programs fall off the map. So this is why we need to work together to sort of create this visibility. Let me give you an example of how we have been working and how these different levels have allowed to readdress in a successful way this lack of information. I am part of a local and national network in Italy. The local organization is CAM, the national network is ReLive. CAM and ReLive decided to work on a shadow report that was presented to GREVIO. When GREVIO visited Italy, we were called with the other national organizations, and we explained what the problems were at a national level. GREVIO gave indications to our country on some of the issues that we had highlighted as critical, and we are currently working also with the government, also at a regional level, to change some of these issues. So that was in and of itself a good aspect. The report that we did as ReLive, we also used at a European level as a template, which is what you find on our website. And I will be telling you a little bit more about today and a lot more on the training of the 13th. This template has allowed any of your organizations to prepare a report, because it can be longer, it can be shorter, but any of these, any input that the GREVIO has from any country is probably more that they get if you don't present it. So even if it's a smaller report, it's still extremely helpful. Through this work with the templates, we approached the Secretariat of the GREVIO Commission, and we asked them for feedback on that. We asked them if that's the information they needed to have. We asked if they were available for training on impact. So we are trying to support the GREVIO Commission and the Secretariat in evaluating perpetrator programs. This put us in the map. And next month, the Council of Europe is doing a commemoration of the Istanbul Convention and of the achievements and the importance of the Istanbul Convention, and they're doing a 15-minute documentary. They have decided to dedicate 4 minutes of these 15 minutes to perpetrator programs. We were able, through this collaboration, locally, nationally, and European, to get perpetrators back on the map at a European level. And why is that important? That's very important because the funding depends on how much we are on the map or not. And the projects, what the lines, what is recognized, what is important, depends on what is on the map. So getting perpetrator programs on the map is fundamental for the funding issues. So back to the Istanbul Convention. Which are the articles that are more relevant and more important to us, and how can we use the Istanbul Convention? So these 4 articles are quite central for the work that we do. I have highlighted some of the sentences that are most important. Obviously, Article 16 is the most central because it's specifically on perpetrator programs. But I want to show you these other points too, because they are part of that larger conversation, because you are going to be probably having, well, I hope I'm going to inspire you to be having more conversations with your local institutions. And so you're going to be engaged in a variety of different conversations for which also these other articles are really important. So in Article 12, we talk about cultural patterns of behaviors of women and men and stereotype roles of men and women and men. So this is important because this is part of what comes before, what builds up, what are the cultural expectations. And so that's really important for us to sort of, for perpetrator programs, for the conversations that we have, to be involved and engaged around this. And on point 4, they talks about the necessary measures to encourage all members of society, especially men and boys, to contribute actively to prevent all forms of violence. So we're on the preventive more, but here it is a specific reference to men and boys. So on the importance of working on masculinities, on engaging men and boys in change, and these are parts of those conversations around accountability that we have to increase and endorse. Article 14 discusses the importance of the equality between women and men. And so this is really important because it takes us back to one of the aspects central to perpetrator program, that is gender equality and non-stereotype gender roles. So again, every time we're talking also about education, there are aspects around mutual respect, non-conflict resolution, gender-based violence that need to be addressed and need to be addressed in non-stereotype gender roles. Now, mind you, some of the conversations around domestic violence are still stereotyped. So there is a lot of work to be done around this. Why is Article 15 important? Article 15 is fundamental because it has to do with the appropriate training of professionals dealing with victims and perpetrators, but also of the training of all service providers that may go into contact with perpetrators or victims. And again, we need to show that specific training for aspects of perpetrators need to be into the dominant conversation, training on social work, training of teachers, training of psychologists, all need to have specific training on victims of violence, but also on perpetrators, because we see so much secondary victimization that is happening, also because perpetrators are able to talk their way around, are not being called on, are not being held accountable. So the appropriate training is really, really important, and again puts us on the map of relevant interventions that are happening on violence against women. And then obviously Article 16. Article 16 is all important for us because it's about preventive intervention and perpetrator programs, treatment of perpetrators. This means that whenever there is pushback on perpetrator programs, if your country has ratified the Istanbul Convention, they are legally binded to promoting and supporting perpetrator programs. Certain kinds of perpetrator programs, and we this article sort of gives us the leverage for the kind of perpetrator programs that we want to see developed. And now to, again, another video that we developed. This is more specifically on the GREVIO reporting. I have sort of mentioned some of the aspects, but again, keep in mind the double level of communication that I was talking about, just sort of to reiterate. Oops, I went one slide ahead instead of starting the video. Here we go.
Violence against women is a serious problem. 1 in 3 women in the EU has experienced domestic violence. To stop the cycle of violence, we need to stop men's violence. Perpetrator programs like yours play an important role in this. Does your government support your work? Comprehensive standards, participation in important decisions, and stable financing represent key support that the government should provide in order to have accountable and effective perpetrator programs. Would you like your voice to be heard? Well, it can be. Article 16 of the Istanbul Convention is legally binding and requires ratifying countries to support perpetrator programs. You can report to GREVIO, the monitoring body of the convention. Why? You can become an important player in your country's coordinated community response and influence GREVIO's recommendations to help end violence against women in your country. Want to know how?
Okay, so I mentioned before a little bit about how to use the GREVIO reporting to lobby. I sort of gave you the picture within when I was talking about the ecological model, so I'm not going to go back to that. I'm just going to mention that on our website we have collected all the relevant information from all the different countries that so far have reported when there is a focus on perpetrator program. So you actually find a compilation of all what has been produced up to now. There's also a summary document that just sort of gives you the highlights of that. Regrettably, it's not so much because there really isn't enough reporting going on to GREVIO. Obviously, there are a lot of questions that NGOs have about as a small NGO, can I still report? How can I manage because I don't have resources? What are the benefits for the organization? My answer to that is that we've made it super easy because we've created a template and you can select the information that you have. You obviously are trying to give a picture of what's happening in your country. But if you have been working in the field for a few years, you have an idea of what's happening in the country. Sometimes you won't have the specific numbers. It may be a question of making a few phone calls, or you don't have the numbers, but also the fact that certain data has not been collected. That is also an important element that can be reported to GREVIO. So both the information that you have, but also the lack of information, especially if it's a structural lack, because there is no sort of government collection of these data, is relevant information for the GREVIO Commission. It could be maybe one of the recommendations that you make. So there's this, on the template on our website, we have a specific area that's on the Istanbul Convention. There are these report, there is the template. And we are more than available to talk you through any of this. Obviously, first take the webinar on the 13th, because we're going to be working on how to do this more concretely on various steps, various issues we were talking about today. But for sure, if you have a look at it, you see that most of the work has been spelled out. Obviously, there are a lot of other resources on our website and on all the information. And again, I would recommend that if you're interested in finding out a little bit more, going more in depth, to join us for the training of the 13th of April from 3 to 6. The training is always free of charge, so you're very welcome to join us. I would like to leave a few minutes, regrettably not very many, if there are any sort of burning questions that we can't wait, that can't be postponed to the 13th. Okay, oh boy, a lot of questions. What are the legal financial consequences for the government that does not meet IC requirements or ignores GREVIO recommendation? It's the same consequences of disrespecting any law in your country. So Nothing. Well,
I'm sorry to say, but disrespecting law in my country does not lead you to prison or losing your job most of the time. Okay.
no, it's there's all, but there are not going to prison or losing the job, but there are procedures. There are legal procedures that you can activate. There are recurrences that can be done to the. It's obviously, it's not about sending people to jail. It's about changing society. So it's about creating political shame, social push on issues that if you are publicly committed to doing certain things in a certain way, then you have to sort of stand behind what you're publicly committed to, what you're legally committed to. I mean, it's as if stealing is against the law. And if the government is stealing, are they going to go to jail? Probably not, but they're not going to look very good if they're stealing. And if you can make public that they are stealing and going against the law. So it's obviously we're within the realm of pushing for change and working with institutions. And obviously, in countries where there is an opposition, it sort of helps, you know, because that sort of balances out what governments are willing or not to do. And it does sort of step into also being active politically, because as a social actor, but you do become active. Public institutions have mandate to hold perpetrators accountable, and on the other hand, provide psychological assistance to perpetrators. Yeah, I don't see what the problem with that is. The question is going to have to be, that's not a contradiction as far as I can see. Okay, so being a perpetrator of violence in family should not be seen as a digital 0-1. It may be a scale with quite a lot of marks on it. Yeah, well, that's exactly the point, trying to create a more nuanced conversation around this, because exactly, the more you have sort of the extreme 0-1, the less perpetrators and victims are going to recognize themselves. So it's okay in terms of zero tolerance if you want to really create social awareness, but I think that now we are sort of in a different phase of how we should be talking. And definitely, if we want to promote perpetrator programs, we need to talk differently. I don't know, Lorna, have you had a chance to have a look at the questions? Are there other burning questions that you think I should address?
No, I think the other comments in the chat were comments about the video that we played at the beginning. And then there's one from Holly, just a comment saying perpetrators are far too often defined by their behavior and not as being a human, which I think is, yeah, it's quite a valid statement. Yeah, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
I think, yeah, that's part of shifting the conversation. And obviously we are talking at different levels, but I think when we are trying to address the general public, when we are trying to engage also with men that may have used violence, we have to shift the conversation to these aspects that are recognizable and that are about being a human being that maybe has done harm, but a human being that maybe wants to change their behavior because they don't want to continue doing harm.
And we just received another question from Natalia. While lobbying for resources for perpetrator programs, it's important to make sure that funding of perpetrator programs is not done at the expense of victim support services. So resources are not taken from them. I think that's a very important point. Maybe you want to respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we haven't mentioned that. I didn't mention it. So thank you, Natalia, for bringing that up. Obviously, we want to support coordinated response. We want to support victim support services because they are sort of the first and essential the lobbying should be done as much as possible in collaboration with women's support services. But when this isn't not possible, it should always be done keeping in mind that we do not want to compete with the resources. What we're talking about is the coordinated response and how resources need to be activated for perpetrators. So that's something that's really important. That's over, so I think we should be wrapping up.
Yeah, so I would just like to add at the end, of course, Alessandra mentioned it, and it's also been in the emails and the sign-up form. We will be having the training on the 13th of April. So I really hope that we have the similar turnout. Thank you so much for everybody for coming today. We had 45 participants. And yeah, so please keep that in your diaries. I'm going to be reaching out to you about the details of that training in the coming days. Please remember to follow us as well on social media to keep up to date with our events and campaigns. And should you have any questions about anything that's come up today in the webinar, please do get in touch with me. You will have my email. And you already were asked to whether you wanted to subscribe to the newsletter. In case you clicked no, but you've changed your mind, you can also go to the homepage of our website and click subscribe. So this has been a very interesting and a very fruitful discussion as well. So thank you for all of those people who contributed in the chat and asked questions. And I think it was a really great introduction to the training that's going to be happening on the 13th. So yeah, do you want to say anything further, Alessandra?
No, thank you all for participating, and I'm looking forward to sort of going more in depth in the conversation and just sort of really trying to figure out how this can be done. It does make a difference, it really does, and there are so many of us throughout Europe. If we can sort of really create a push towards acknowledging huge impact and show. Thank you for saying this, and let's get to work. Actually, let's have a nice Easter break first, and then let's get back to work.
Have a nice Easter for those
who thank you for joining us, and see you soon, hopefully.
Okay, bye everyone.